something other than COVID-19. So I know that we have some speakers later in the session this morning and maybe this afternoon that will be talking about some of the impacts of the pandemic on real estate, but I'm really pleased to be able to talk about something a little more upbeat and cheerful. So I'm going to be talking to you today about green infrastructure and sustainable design. I'm really proud to work for a developer like Vulcan, but what I'm most proud of really is my family. And I just want to give a quick shout out to them. They're my rock, and I really, really appreciate them. This is us on a family vacation about 3 years ago, back when we were able to travel the world widely and freely. I know I said I wasn't going to get into the pandemic, but that's one of the things that I personally am missing the most right now, is the ability to just get out and see the world, because I think we learn so much about ourselves and others when we can do that. This was us in Mauritius, an island in the Indian Ocean, which I learned later actually is a place that people like to go to launder money, so who knew? But I didn't do that there. Anyway, back onto Vulcan. So a lot of you probably know Vulcan as a real estate developer, because that's a core business that's very visible that we do here in the Pacific Northwest. But I want to take a minute to go and talk a little bit about Vulcan as an organization and what we do and why that impacts how we do real estate development. So Vulcan was founded in 1986. It's the engine behind the late Paul G. Allen's network of organizations and initiatives. And basically, Paul founded this company to try to make the world a better place. We work to be catalysts for change through a combination of technology, philanthropy, research, media, policy, and commercial ventures. We work across a range of focus areas, and we develop solutions with the potential to have the greatest impact on our planet and to drive new frontiers that enrich humanity. Our 4 focus areas are climate change, ocean health, wildlife conservation, and community. And thoughtful investing is how we fuel our work in those focus areas. We do this through Vulcan Real Estate and Vulcan Capital. And Vulcan Capital is the arm of the organization that invests in everything that is not direct real estate investment. From our real estate development here in the Pacific Northwest to our capital investment around the world, we don't just invest, we seek opportunities that help make the world a better place. We preserve historic buildings, build to best-in-class green standards, invest in companies seeking to deliver life-saving medicine and electricity to the world's most difficult to reach places. And now, more than ever, our investment portfolio is critical to sustain our organization's work in climate, oceans, wildlife, and community to benefit generations to come. But the drive of combating climate change and supporting healthy communities doesn't just happen in our philanthropic work. It's also part of our investment practice, and that's what brings me back to Vulcan Real Estate. We're a team of about 35 people. We've been developing in earnest here for about 15 years, and we focus on creating lasting value by developing spaces that are attractive from an economic, environmental, and social perspective. About 90% of our development has been in Seattle's South Lake Union neighborhood, which is where we've also completed some green infrastructure projects that I will be talking about in a little bit. But I'd like to go back and just remind people of what South Lake Union looked like all those years ago and how much it has transformed. So here's South Lake Union in 2002, and you can see a couple things here. There really isn't much development other than the short little warehouses. There's a lot of surface parking lots, lots of concrete, and not a lot of green space. This neighborhood has seen about 20 million square feet of development in the past 15 years. About half of that has been Vulcan and half has been other folks. And development can be really tough on the environment. And what's unique about South Lake Union is we had this opportunity to take this brownfield and clean it up while we developed in a sustainable fashion. So we were able to proactively implement measures to improve the environment through sustainable building practices, including our green infrastructure projects. Some more images from the old days. We had a strip club, a Hooters, a porn shop, Those were all tenants of Vulcan that we inherited when we bought other properties for redevelopment. And you can just see it was sort of a concrete jungle. Traffic was really horrible. Mercer was essentially a giant one-way on-ramp to the freeway, and traffic would back up all the way, past Seattle Center, all the way almost to Elliott Bay. And you can see the overhead traffic wires, just not a really attractive place. And so the transformation over the past 15 years has been quite remarkable. So here it is today. Almost the same picture you see behind me if you're seeing my little, my little Zoom face here. But you can see now a lot more green space, a lot of development. South Lake Union now, as you know, is just the center of tech and biotech, lots of restaurants and retail. At the moment, those are not able to be frequented as people might want, but we will come back to that someday. And in this neighborhood, I think will really endure what we're going through right now. And then just another montage of the types of things you see today walking through the neighborhood. So instead of the strip club and the porn shop and Hooters, you see artwork, you see people gathering at sidewalk cafes. You'll see, historic renovation of buildings. And it's just much more interesting place to walk around. A lot of what we've done has to do with placemaking. So creating places where people want to gather or want to visit. On the upper left here, you'll see the Woonerf. That's one of the green infrastructure projects I'll be talking about in a few minutes. The top right is the South Lake Union Block Party. That's been going on for 15 years. This year was the first year we haven't been able to have the block party, which is sad because from a standpoint of getting community together, we really missed that, but also we rely on the block party as a fundraiser for local nonprofits. So unfortunately, we couldn't do that this year, but to date, we've raised about $200,000 for local nonprofits through the block party. And you'll see Lake Union Park, gathering place for children with the Bubble Man and some artwork. So it's all about creating places that people want to be. And again, the art program in South Lake Union is extensive. If you walk through the neighborhood, you will see artwork, some of it hanging, some of it attached to buildings, some of it on the sidewalks and in plazas. Just makes the neighborhood more interesting and helps us support local artists. We've commissioned about 25 artworks throughout the neighborhood, and you can see them as you walk through the many streets in South Lake Union. And then finally, the neighborhood changed significantly because of the benefit of public-private partnerships. So that's what helped bring the streetcar to the neighborhood. It's what made Mercer into this two-way boulevard with this landscape median. It created the Lake Union Park you see on the upper right, and then also the swale on Yale, which is the bottom right. And again, that's an infrastructure project that I'll be talking about in a few more minutes. So what is green infrastructure? Why do we do it, and what are the results? According to the EPA, it is a cost-effective, resilient approach to managing wet weather impacts that provides many community benefits. So it's important because we know stormwater is a major cause of pollution in urban areas. Every time it rains, and it rains here a lot, we know that the rainy season is coming shortly, unfortunately. Every time it rains, contaminants get washed off the streets and sent right into the watershed. We're talking pesticides, fertilizer, metal, oils, petroleum, lots of gunk from the cars that we drive. And these toxins are damaging to the ecosystem. They're really bad for the environment. And as a result, we invest in green infrastructure that aims at addressing and treating stormwater at its source as a proactive measure, so it gets cleaned up before it can do damage. There was a study done by NOAA in 2015 that found that an adult coho salmon dies in as few as 2.5 hours after being exposed to toxic runoff from stormwater. Now, they're a particularly sensitive species, but it doesn't mean that these toxins are good for the rest of the salmon out there. The Puget Sound Chinook, or king salmon, is a threatened species and is the primary food for our resident orca whales. In August 2019, the orca population was at its lowest level in 30 years. Now, you might have heard recently 2 more calves have been born to the J pod out here. So hopefully we're turning that around and our orcas will help, will start to grow the pod size in the coming years. But as the Puget Sound continues to have record-breaking development, the way and extent we implement stormwater and green standards of development will determine how successful we are at protecting our long-term watershed health. So one of the tools we're using to achieve sustainable development that addresses water quality and water use is Salmon Safe. Salmon Safe is a certification program that links site development and land management practices with the protection of water quality, habitat, and urban watersheds. It applies to development practices during construction, as well as post-construction practices associated with building operations. It aims to safeguard the region's natural waterways and fish species through several broad principles, including managing water at the source and limiting water demand. The Salmon Safe program is really interesting. It started in Oregon as a system to help farmers and do more sustainable agricultural practices. So Salmon Safe partnered with farmers and came up with ways that would be less detrimental to the environment. As you know, agriculture requires a lot of fertilizers and pesticides. It's very heavy water use. So Salmon Safe worked in that area. They still do, and you can actually get Salmon Safe certified wines and other products. But then they moved into the commercial real estate area. They started with suburban office, like the Nike campus down in Oregon. And then some years ago, they reached out to Vulcan and decided to take that model and try it in an urban setting. And so that's how we got involved with Salmon Safe. We've been partnering with them for a number of years. And in 2015, we piloted their program for developer accreditation. And we are a Salmon Safe accredited developer. We're actually the only one. We've been hoping that we could get others on board, and that hasn't quite happened yet, but we have had a really big impact on the industry. And I'll explain how in a minute. So our commitments around being a Salmon Safe accredited developer include getting a Salmon Safe assessment of every site that we get ready to develop. We require our general contractors to be Salmon Safe certified. And then we also have committed to educating the public with signage, like the signage that you see here on the screen that surrounds a development project. To qualify for Salmon Safe certification, each project must meet Salmon Safe development principles of protecting habitat and water quality during construction. Now, one of the most measurable qualifications is our commitment to development that creates zero sediment runoff. So that means that we are filtering out, when we dewater, when you dig those big holes for development and you have it full of water and you take that water out, we filter all of that water and clean out the contaminants so that there's no sediment that goes back into the watershed. And what's interesting about this is by requiring our general contractors to be Salmon Safe certified, they are committing to zero sediment runoff construction at every project, whether it's a salmon certified project or not. So even when you have other developers that might be developing something that's not Salmon Safe certified, their contractors most likely are engaging in practices that are better for the watershed. So we're really proud of that impact that we've been able to have on the industry locally. Post-construction requirements include incorporating strategies that treat stormwater, providing ecologically functioning habitat, and a commitment to water conservation methods. The certification process involves an interdisciplinary team, including scientists from local universities and private sector partners. They're all called on to conduct an assessment on behalf of Salmon Safe. So they come out to our sites, they take a look at each site and determine the best strategies for conducting development on the site in a way that meets the Salmon Safe requirements. And at completion, you can see some elements that are truly beautiful and also play a role in stormwater management and conservation, such as this little mini sort of swale here you see on the left, some green gardening practices on the roof. This is the boutique apartments. So all kinds of things, ecologically functioning habitat, vegetated roofs and green walls, and then water conservation through the use of cisterns to collect and reuse rainwater, bioretention planters that naturally filter out contaminants. And we really like the science and peer review behind Salmon Safe. We feel that it really gets a lot of stakeholders involved and keeps us online to do our best practices of development. So I'm going to transition into talking about some green infrastructure projects. On the left, you can see the swale on Yale. This is over in the Cascade part of the South Lake Union neighborhood in fairly close proximity to REI, which I'm sure most of you shop at regularly. I know I do. And then on the right is the 8th Avenue Wharf that I'll get to in a few minutes as well. So the swale on Yale is perhaps our most ambitious green infrastructure project. It's actually technically known as the Capitol Hill Water Quality Project, but when you're building a swale and you just happen to have it on a street called Yale, you can't help but come up with something a little catchier. So the swale on Yale is actually on Yale and Pontius avenues. And there's 4 swales, so they go along the east and west sides of 2 full block developments. So a swale is essentially a vegetated ditch designed to slow stormwater flow so that the contaminants can be removed naturally by the plant materials that are inside the ditch. This was a public-private partnership between Seattle Public Utilities and Vulcan. And we had a shared vision for sustainability and agreed to share construction costs and future maintenance costs. This was an $11 million project. The city dedicated the right-of-way, so you can see here there's no parking here. They dedicated the parking strip for the swale, and then Vulcan set back our building another 1 extra foot so that the sidewalk can still be at a nice 6-foot wide area, allowing pedestrians to go past, and then the swale there, of course, is between the pedestrians and the cars that would drive on the street. In addition to helping fund design and construction, we also manage the construction of the 4 swales as part of 2 development projects. What's interesting about the swale, usually when you walk down the street or even through your neighborhood, I know there are programs now through the city where if you live in a certain part of Seattle, you can have the city come in and create your own little sort of rain garden, which is like a little swale. Typically, when you see these types of treatments at the street level, they are treating stormwater on site. Now, what's unique about this swale is it does not treat stormwater that's generated on site. It is actually treating stormwater from Capitol Hill. So in the past, Capitol Hill, this 435-acre area of Capitol Hill, all of the stormwater would be diverted into a big pipe, and it would just run straight into Lake Union untreated. Well now, and if you can see the diagram on the bottom right, it shows how the stormwater from Capitol Hill comes through the pipes and then is sent through the swales to have the contaminants cleaned out. Then it goes back into the pipe and into South Lake Union, or into Lake Union. So these swales treat 190 million gallons of water annually. So that's about the top 3 feet of Lake Union. It's enough to fill 288 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we're talking a lot of water that's getting cleaned up through this system. Each of the swales is about 270 feet long, so essentially the entire length of the sidewalk of the block. They range from 10 to 17 feet wide. They're from 10 inches to 23 inches deep. Phase 1 was completed about 7 years ago, and then the second phase was completed just a year ago. Again, next to the Sitka Apartments near REI. The community benefits that come from these swales include just beautiful greenery in an urban setting. Before, this was just sort of a concrete jungle, so now you have all of this greenery and plants. We have a cleaner Lake Union. More than 90% of the contaminants are getting filtered out by the swales. And then you have educational signage like you see here that tells people about the swales and what they do and why they're important for our environment. While we're on the topic of sustainability, I wanted to talk also about some of the sustainable features of the Stackhouse Apartments that are next to the first phase of the swale. These apartments include 2 LEED Platinum buildings and then a LEED Gold rehabilitated historic structure, which you see here on the upper right. You also see on the upper right here, sort of behind the pedestrian, a silver cistern. And cisterns were an important part of this project. We incorporated a number of rainwater cisterns. So basically, they capture rainwater, and then all of that water is used to irrigate the roof garden, all of the landscaping in the courtyards and around the property. 100% of the irrigation at this project comes from rainwater. We also used a reverse cycle chiller, and that is a system that was fairly new technology at the time. I know others have started doing it since then. So basically, this is a system that takes the ambient air from your garage, where it's usually, you know, quite a bit warmer than the outside, and it captures that extra heat and uses it to heat domestic water for the apartments above. And this is a system that's about 2.5 times more efficient than a traditional system. So we're using a lot fewer of our natural resources to heat water at the project. When he heard about what we were doing, Governor Inslee was very interested in this. So he came and took a look. This is my colleague, Brandon Morgan, giving him a tour a few years ago. He was very engaged, very interested. I think if you know anything about his politics, you certainly are aware of his commitment to fighting climate change. So this as a something that's conserving resources was of great interest to him. Now the block south of there, the Sitka Apartments, this is where the other 2 swales are located on the east and west sides of the project. This is the courtyard in between the buildings. And this project also incorporated a number of sustainable development strategies. You'll see this darling tree house in the courtyard that has a green roof. I lost my place on my notes. Okay, great, sorry. This was a particularly contaminated site. About 15,000 tons of contaminated soils were removed, so it's a much cleaner site than it was before. And of course, that results in any runoff that comes from this project being nice and clean and going into the watershed without contaminants. So you have the green roof, we have green awnings. All of the roof drainage is directed to one of 5 bioretention planters. And in this case, we use these extra large planters that exceed the City of Seattle guidelines. And we're providing stormwater management that goes beyond regulatory requirements. Now, whereas we used the reverse cycle chiller at the Stackhouse Apartments, here we went a step beyond that for a wastewater heat recovery system. And at Sitka, we are using a first-in-country system to heat domestic hot water, and this is a 4 to 6 times more efficient system than a traditional system. So basically, in this case, you know, all of that, each time you take a shower or you wash your clothes or you're washing dishes, all that hot water goes out to the sewer. Well, it's still hot. There's a lot of heat to capture there. So we're using this system that captures that heat that would normally go into the sewer, and now we're using it to heat domestic hot water here. So this is just another way of conserving resources or finding ways to not waste resources. And this has been a really great system for us, and I think we'll probably be using it at some of our development projects going into the future. I actually was talking about the wastewater heat recovery system when I had the slide on for the gray water. So gray water is something else we're doing. We're actually using, capturing all of the gray water that comes out of the apartments. And we're using that to water plants on site. A cistern system here really wouldn't work because it's such a large project. So we can use a 2,000-gallon tank of gray water versus 70,000-gallon cistern. And so we're using the gray water to water all of the plants here, everything except for the rooftop edible garden, which is tapping into municipal water supply. And then here's a picture of how the wastewater heat recovery system works that I described a few minutes ago. And now we'll move over to the arbor blocks, the Woonurf. So this is over on 8th Avenue, kind of over in the western part of the neighborhood. We took a new approach to the treatment of the street between two new office buildings. These are office buildings that are leased to Facebook. We converted 8th Avenue into a pedestrian-friendly Woonurf. And what the heck is a Woonurf? A Woonurf is essentially, it's a Dutch word that essentially describes what you see here. So it's a street with an absence of curbs. This one is kind of has a meandering shape. There's an array of vegetated areas and seating, and it discourages use as a through street for cars. So while you can drive on the Woonurf, it's completely legal. It is a right-of-way, public right-of-way. You kind of feel like you shouldn't be there because of the way it kind of meanders through, and at the north and south ends, there's even like a little curb, almost like an inch curb, so you feel like you're kind of going into a forbidden territory. And so that really makes it very pedestrian friendly and bike friendly, and people can just cross back and forth between these two buildings. This Woonurf incorporates 12 planting areas and green roofs that substantially increase the urban habitat compared to what was there before. There were some sweet gum trees along 8th Avenue before that we've retained, but you can see we've added quite a bit more greenery here. And the plants and trees are native, so it minimizes the need for extensive irrigation. This is the lakefront blocks in South Lake Union. This is where Google has its offices, and then there are two luxury apartment towers on top of the office buildings. Mercer is a really busy street with about 70,000 cars per day. So going back to our commitment to Salmon Safe, one of those commitments was learning landscapes, educating the public about Salmon Safe. You saw some of that signage on an earlier slide. And so this provided us a great opportunity, this project, for lining, several blocks of Mercer with that signage about Salmon Safe development practices. We wrapped the construction signage around the projects. We did this also at the Sitka Apartments, and we would direct people on the signage to our website, vulcansalmonsafe.com, where they could learn more about the program and why we were engaged in it. Another aspect of our sustainable development practices has to do with environmental remediation. And as I mentioned, South Lake Union is incredibly contaminated. So we've had an opportunity to clean up a tremendous amount of contamination there. We've spent $40 million, and we're still cleaning up sites there as we develop them. The contaminants came mostly from dry cleaning facilities and gas stations. And some of that stuff is just, is really, really bad. Not surprising, looking at the history of South Lake Union as an industrial place. But interestingly enough, I would think our most expensive cleanup will be at the West Main project in Bellevue. You wouldn't expect the Bellevue CBD to have a huge contamination problem, but we do have a site there that has a tremendous amount of contamination that we are remediating right now. We also talk about historic renovation when we talk about sustainability, because really what is more sustainable than keeping something and reusing it instead of throwing it away? So here are 4 of our 5 buildings that we ultimately renovated. You might remember the one on the upper left, the Pacific McKay, Ford McKay auto dealership. When I started at Vulcan 18 years ago, it was still an active auto showroom. You could go in there and buy your car. I remember seeing it was a little, I can't remember the model number and name, but it was the BMW when they came out with their little sports car, and it was in there. It was very sexy and made you really want to drive it. This building, that was pretty ambitious. This building was in the path of the Mercer Corridor expansion. And so we decided that we wanted to preserve that building. We disassembled it, marked every piece with a number and a code, That was about 3,000 pieces of terracotta, including, you know, a fountain inside and the floor inside and everything you see here. And we put it in storage in one of the warehouses we had in South Lake Union, where it sat for 5 years. And then we recreated it when we built the Allen Institute. So its location today is about 60 feet north of where you might have known it to be in the past. The building on the right was turned into a restaurant. That was an old cabinet factory. The lower right was the Richmond Laundry. So that's one of the many commercial laundry facilities in South Lake Union, and that was incorporated into the Alley 24 apartments, which are really cool. The inside still has, you know, a lot of the units still have the original brick on the inside. The lower left, that's another laundry facility. That's part of the, that's right on the same block as the Stackhouse apartments. This building, I mean, you can see the awful job somebody did on that lower corner there, where you used to have the green paint. So anyway, I just want to sort of highlight what these buildings looked like then, and then what they've been transformed into today. So you can see again that lower left building, we recreated the corner so it fits in with what the original style was, and it really just shows that, you know, keeping some of these interesting buildings when they are interesting enough to keep really does a lot for the community and the neighborhood. That building on the lower left, the Supply Laundry building, is an interesting one. We piloted a program there because the entire structure was deemed to be historic. So that really means you cannot make many changes other than bringing it back to its original state. So for example, we could not put in double pane windows, which would be required to meet the energy code today. So the energy code, as it was written, really has these prescribed methods of what you need to do to a building before you actually build it. In this case, we were able to pilot a program and come up with strategies that we thought would work, and then have the building operational, test out how it's doing, and then go back to them and say, hey, it looks, you know, it worked, or if it didn't, go back to the building and make modifications after construction. And that was very successful for us. In this case, we addressed the window issue by constructing storm windows that essentially go on the inside of the windows during the winter. So the tenant erects those storm windows in the winter so we don't lose heat. And then that building actually did perform like we expected. So that was really great. So we don't just do green building and infrastructure in South Lake Union. That makes sense because the lake is there, but water runs off someplace from everywhere. So here we have Yesler buildings that we've developed. Problem with Zoom meetings, you don't have a laser pointer, but the buildings in the foreground here, those are 2 apartment projects that we completed on this side of the smokestack that you see there. So at Yesler, the runoff goes into Elliott Bay, which is a migratory route for all 7 salmon species. Our first project, Batik, the one further west, includes 45,000 square feet of native or adaptive landscaping, in addition to more than 4,000 square feet of green roofs. Both of these projects have LEED Platinum certification. At Batik, stormwater from about 80% of the project's surface area is treated through vegetated bioretention structures. These are really, really wonderful. They incorporate 20% affordable housing. They have just incredible views of Mount Rainier and the city. And leasing was really, really positive when these buildings opened. Obviously, with the pandemic, we've had some challenges maintaining occupancy, but we're working on some strategies to incentivize folks to come live here. We're also working in the central area. So a few years ago, let's see, should I lose? Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so a few years ago, we bought this site in the central area. It's a really big site. It's over 3 acres. It looked like this, lots of concrete, very gray, and you can just, I guess a picture's worth 1,000 words. It's not a very attractive place. Today, that same area looks like this. We just completed this project a couple months ago. 36% of the new development consists of open space. And this is an aerial of the building. So there's 2 buildings. And then in between them is this large 60 by 390 foot landscape public pathway that provides pedestrian access, stormwater management infrastructure, and a habitat for native pollinators, which will attract butterflies, bees, hummingbirds, all of those great critters that help our world be a better place. The stormwater management strategy utilizes an extensive system of bioretention planters designed to filter more than 600,000 gallons of rainwater annually. The project has 5,700 square feet of bioretention facilities that will capture 80% of roof runoff. This project is Salmon Safe certified, and it's also on track to receive a LEED Platinum certification. And then moving over to Bellevue, where we have a couple development projects. We are including similar strategies there. West Main is a 1 million square foot 3-building office project. This is the one I mentioned earlier that has a lot of contamination that we're dealing with. It's another big site, about 4 acres, and it will also include this 20,000 square foot 3-block open space with bioretention facilities as well. And then the 555 Tower, this is at 108th. This will be a 42 square foot high-rise office, also with 1 million square feet. Again, you can kind of see the human scale here at the ground plane where pedestrians experience the building. There's a retail pavilion along the Grand Connection pedestrian corridor that will feature a green roof. And then an area here also, I think right at the top of the stairs perhaps, is where we will have an off-leash dog area. And the walkway will meander in front of this light-filled retail pavilion that will also provide a significant public benefit. In total, the project will have more than 21,000 square feet of publicly accessible outdoor area in the public plaza and pedestrian corridor. So I'd like to wrap up just with a couple thoughts about green infrastructure incentives. These are largely absent at the jurisdictional level, so a lot of developers are not doing it voluntarily. And we're at a point right now where jurisdictions have this incredible opportunity to take a leadership position and to encourage green infrastructure as part of every development project. And like any incentive, we need to think broadly, because what appeals to one developer might not appeal to another developer. Something for us like expedited permitting or reduced utility hookup fees would be a big incentive and perhaps less controversial than additional building height and FAR, which has traditionally been the path that most jurisdictions use when it comes to incentives. So I think we really need to get in a situation where we have all types of people in the room to come up with some win-win strategies so that we see more green infrastructure improvements throughout our urban areas. We need the developers, the government, the environmentalists, maybe even a few appraisers to get together, you know, the .coms, the .nets, .orgs, .edus, .govs, everybody in the room to come up with some ideas that can keep development going on track to have our environment protected more as we see so much development in our region. Thank you very much for letting me talk to you today. Appreciate it.
Good. Deanne, I'm going to ask just a quick question of checking in. Are we taking questions now? Do you have questions, or should we just keep moving on? I know that we're just kind of some ways on the fly here.
We were going to take questions at the end.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Yeah, I know that we all went through this before, and why did I have to ask that? So, Lori, that was really, really great. What's really nice is having you know, having all the problems we've got around the world and here in Seattle around environmental issues and the concern, it's so exciting to have a company that's on the cutting edge of this and having this as a central core feature. So thanks a lot. I really have appreciated that. So what we're going to do is take a quick moment and just recognize our generous sponsors. So the platinum sponsor is CBRE, the silver sponsor is LIA Administrators, and our bronze sponsors are McKee Appraisal and Rock and Associates. And then for those folks that had signed up to be friends of the conference, it's Matt Bacon, myself, Todd Henderson, Mel Morgan, Mitch Olson, Renee Schaefer, Stan Cedor. And we just want to just take a quick moment to thank everyone for who is attending in support and those that supported at a corporate and a personal level for financial assistance, because this is really a chapter benefit, chapter service, and then the folks that contributed financially really truly appreciate it, because you know this is a huge change from what we normally do. And I'm gonna just say this, I can't go any further without thanking Mitch Olson, who's done really so much work to get this thing off the ground. I'm going to now introduce Matt Behrens, and it's just so easy to say, if you need to do anything hotel related, Matt and his partner, Chris Burdett, are the folks to go to in the Pacific Northwest. They sell more hotels and advise more hotel clients. And I had the privilege of working with Matt several years ago, and actually for a number of years, Matt and Chris both, phenomenal hotel specialists. But you know, what's really important to me is not just the ability and what his professional capabilities are, but you know, I know Matt does things outside of the office besides being incredibly dedicated to his family. You know, I know for a number of years he was involved with doing some volunteer work. You could find him on the December 25th in downtown Seattle, handing out socks and mittens with his family. A number of other things that he's done. He just plugs into the community in addition to what he does for his work. So, you know, there's a lot of facets of people like Matt, and I'm just really grateful to have him part of the conference. So Matt, to you, and like I say, anything hotel related, he is the expert.
Okay. Scott, I really appreciate that. Appreciate your friendship and the opportunity to speak in front of the group today. As Scott mentioned, I'll keep it brief. I have a short window of time. There's been a lot of activity in the hotel sector. So really the focus of my presentation today it really revolves around the staggering demand shock that we have experienced and continue to experience in this sector. Obviously, this is a defined event that has affected demand in our industry. We believe that the event will go away at some point, and the big question is really the timing of it. And from a valuation standpoint and an economic standpoint, that's something that we've put a lot of thought and study to. The hotel business in general, there are three primary segments of demand that we focus on, and that's the leisure segment, which has been quite robust even through the pandemic. Corporate and group are the other two segments that I'm going to speak to, and those are really the demand segments that have essentially vanished during the pandemic. And one of the things, you know, that I believe that we're going to need in order to recover in our business is really the vaccine and distribution of the vaccine, or a strong therapeutic that will give business, corporate demand, and groups the confidence to return to travel again, to really ensure that their employees and loved ones are safe when they're out traveling. Let's see, I'm having a little, apologize, I'm having a tough time driving here. Oh, there we go. So one of the key metrics that we track, and our company has actually tracked for almost 100 years, is the occupancy level on a U.S. national basis. And what's really staggering is we're forecasting in 2020 to end the year at a level nationally below 40%. And this is dramatically lower than what we saw during the GFC, where we had around a 64% national occupancy level. After 9/11, we finished the year at 65% roughly. And during the Great Depression, back in 1933, we finished the year at almost a 45% occupancy level. So we are really in uncharted territory in the hotel sector today. So one of the key things that we've been doing to advise our clients has really been a difficult decision to close an owner's hotel or keep it open. So what we have done is study the economics, looking at historical data, looking at minimal security staffing levels to compare what the cost would be to fundamentally shut down your hotel versus keeping it open during these trying times, especially in the major CBDs. And it's not a simple calculation, and really its ramifications aren't trivial. Hotels are major employers, tax drivers, and their presence on street corners have a huge impact on neighboring businesses, retail, and the surrounding communities. And what's staggering today in Seattle, today, the present, our MSA, roughly 10% of the hotel inventory is closed down today. And that's about 2 times the national average. So to kind of put this in perspective, the average cost, for example, for a limited service hotel that has a little over 100 rooms is roughly $38,000 a month to have that hotel shut down. So what we're doing is we're studying the economics of that particular hotel, comparing it to what the burn rate would be to keeping the asset open, and running those models to anticipate how long it's going to take for those cash flows to return to get to a point where they're profitable to open again. So it's a dramatic number, and that number doesn't include any kind of rent payment or debt service amount that would be required to continue to operate that hotel. Sorry, I have a little bit of a delay here. So one of the other fundamental questions that we get asked a lot by our clients is what's happening to values today. So to help illustrate the current bid-ask spread, we've developed the following chart. We believe that we hit a point of maximum uncertainty in our industry back in April and began to realize the extent of the impacts of the future lower cash flows soon thereafter. As time passes, the current performance levels, owners are now facing, at the current performance levels, owners are now facing the impact of lower future cash flows. So for me, as time passes and as the current performance levels, owners are now facing increased liquidity pressure, which is lowering the ask price for assets that are currently on the market. And to put that in perspective, we're looking at, again, at the cash burn and lender obligations as relief expires in our space. On the other side, investors are searching for clarity and for data. And as time passes, more certainty on a recovery timeframe unfolds, and that increases the bid price as more certainty returns to the market. Frankly, there really hasn't been a whole lot of marks as far as trades nationally in the hotel segment since COVID began. But on the trades that we have seen and have worked on, if you drill down on those trades, I think that there is a established average of a degradation of value of around 15 to 30% from where the values would have been at a year-end level in 2019. So that's an average. Now a durable asset in a top-tier market is going to trade well with the side of that. And we've also found that a hotel asset that has strong underlying fundamentals, for example, a big value play or sits on a large tract of land that would be redeveloped in the midterm, those assets aren't experiencing the same type of degradation of value that we knew before. On the other hand, a vulnerable asset that is in a secondary or less desirable market could trade wide of that range. And getting into our scenario, our forecast scenario, a couple of our assumptions are there. What we're seeing, this is a forecast for the greater Seattle MSA in the hotel sector. And if you look at the first two columns, our occupancy and our average daily rate. The final column is RevPAR, the combination of those two metrics. And so what we saw in 2019 is a point of stabilization as we've had a lot of supply enter the market, but we were absorbing that supply in 2019. Our forecast in 2019 for 2020 is illustrated in that peach shaded section. The projections are beyond that. So what we are anticipating for our baseline projections for the U.S. is a significant decline of about 52% in 2020, and then starting to rebound to our 2019 levels in around 2023, 2024 nationally. In Seattle, I'll drill down a little bit in Seattle. I have received a few questions in some other markets, and I apologize. I have about 8 more minutes, so it's going to be difficult for me to touch on those, but I'll give you some high-level stats on the Seattle MSA. And the Seattle MSA is really encompassing about 400 hotels and 50,000 rooms in the region. And there's some interesting facets of the Seattle MSA that really put us at a disadvantage as far as a recovery from some of our peer MSAs. And some of those factors really pertain to the composition of our existing stock of demand. So in Seattle, the Seattle MSA, 59% of our overall hotels are what we consider upper priced hotels. And over the case of the COVID period, mid-scale economy and upper mid-scale hotels have outperformed the upper upscale and luxury segments. Another factor is geographic locations of hotels that have performed better in the COVID era. We've seen strong leisure demand go to destinations like Central Oregon, Central Washington, Oregon coast, and not so much the CBD markets. So if you look at the composition of the Seattle MSA, 72% of our inventory is really concentrated in the Seattle CBD, the airport, and the Bellevue market. So that also puts us at a strategic disadvantage as far as a recovery from the national picture that I just showed. Apologize, there's a bit of delay every time I try to advance the slide. And downtown Seattle, I'll dive into a little bit. We saw a very significant increase in hotel stock enter the market from 2016 through 2019 in downtown Seattle. Really a massive uptick of hotels. About 2,800 rooms entered the market. That represented a 20% increase from the base back in 2006. And one hotel in particular was really a market mover as far as supply was concerned. The Hyatt Regency, a 1,264 room hotel, entered the market in 2018, and that was a 9% addition to that base on its own. What we did see that was very positive was the absorption of that stock hotel was starting to take hold in late 2019, in the beginning of 2020. We actually saw one of our best months on record, February 2020, where we saw an increase of about 8% RevPAR year over year that month. So we started to see a real positive uptick, and then obviously in March, COVID had a dramatic impact on our business. Some of despite the pandemic, we've had a number of hotels enter the market, and I'll quickly just go through those. South Lake Union, we saw citizenM enter the market back in May. Last month, the Lotte Hotel opened after about a 2-year period of being complete. In South Lake Union, we have a Marriott being constructed as we speak. In the east side, in Bellevue Redmond corridor, the Archer Hotel opened up at the Redmond Town Center last year. Last month, the Hilton Garden opened in Redmond. And in Bellevue right now, we have a hotel, a Holiday Inn Express, that actually was under construction that's been paused just south of the Greenbaum home furnishing sites. In the south end, we had a Residence Inn open up last year. And we have 2 hotels currently under construction in the South End, 2 in Tukwila, an Element, and as well as a Tru Hilton product. This chart's really interesting on my left. What we've seen was a dramatic increase in supply between 2017 and 2019 in the Seattle MSA. We actually ranked 3rd nationally as far as amount of hotels, rooms that were delivered during that point in time, just behind Nashville and Denver. So, not a great list to be on if you're a hotel owner. The positive news is our forecast period from 2020 through 2024. We're no longer in that top 10 as far as supply that's going to be added to the market. So what I want to quickly show you is a comparison between the national summary that I showed earlier and the current Seattle MSA forecast. And because of the reasons that I briefly talked about before, we are at a disadvantage to a recovery. So we believe that we're going to have a stronger RevPAR decline, the key metric that we use in the hotel space, in 2020. The national forecast is 52% decline. We expect to see about a 67% decline, and then a robust climb out of that in the Seattle market. We believe it's going to take a little bit longer to get back to 2018 and 2019 levels in Seattle versus our national forecast. So we're forecasting that we get close to our 2019 performance levels in 2024, whereas nationally we believe that we will achieve those levels and eclipse them in many markets in 2024. And I don't want to end on too much negative news. There's not a lot of positive news in our business, but there are extremely strong fundamentals that lead us to believe that the Seattle market in particular will have a really robust recovery. One is the amount of office space that has been recently delivered and continues to be delivered in the downtown market. Another is, we are fortunate to have great companies, including Vulcan, we heard from before, Microsoft, and Amazon, who continue to provide the region with great jobs and are in really robust growth markets. CBRE conducted a tech talent survey recently that surveyed all North American markets for tech talent. Seattle continues to be one of the top tech talent markets in the country. That's going to continue to fuel growth. We're also excited about the NHL coming to Seattle. That will be a good leisure demand generator for our hotel businesses going forward. Another really positive demand generator long-term for our market is the waterfront redevelopment. The tunnel, the SR 99 tunnel in Seattle, being buried and built out as a park system, we believe will be an enormous leisure demand generator in the mid to long term for Seattle. And finally, the convention center. Seattle has been remarkably underserved versus our peer cities for our ability to attract big group business, which is a key demand generator for any market. The addition of the convention center, which we still expect to open in 2022, will have an enormous growth potential in our group business segment. And finally, one of the stats that I like to share with people that are looking at investing in the hotel market in Seattle is a metric that we track. We track MSA's office square footages versus the amount of hotel rooms that are in those same geographic areas. And Seattle has a extremely healthy amount of square footage of office space per hotel room, about 3,300 square feet of office space per hotel room. So, really stacks up well versus our peer city, supports corporate demand in the mid to long term for our outlook. And my final stat, I know I'm a minute over, but in the Seattle market, we are forecasting a really dramatic amount of business year over year increases in demand. Seattle, it looks like we're going to be ranked 1 or 2 in the nation going forward, as well as our average compounded RevPAR change. So So we do have a positive outlook. We've fallen a long way, and we expect to climb back out of it. So I really appreciate your time. I've met my quota. I apologize for my delays on my advancing my slides, but I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate the insight. And it is pretty eye-opening what impact that COVID's had on hospitality, especially the choices that you had to instruct your owners to make, stay open or close. That's just absolutely wild to me. So let's keep hoping for a vaccine to be developed soon. So next we have Lance Sasser with retail. Lance is a senior associate investment sales specialist at Capital Pacific. He's over 10 years of experience with sales of small single tenant buildings to larger regional power centers throughout the Pacific Northwest. So please welcome Lance Sasser.
Thanks, guys. Just requested control over my slide, so hopefully that's showing up. Okay. Yeah, appreciate the intro. Matt, great job. That was actually really interesting to me. We track hotel just demand in general. We've been hit pretty hard down here in Portland as well. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Lance. I've been with this company, like said, for 10 years. I started before brokerage as kind of the head of research and analytics here. Had the opportunity to get out on the road for probably 400 or 500 nights over a course of 5 years. All of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Alaska. That's kind of our regional playground, if you will. We don't do leasing. We don't do property management. We just specifically focus on investment sales. And when you do that with a larger group of people, you need a little bit larger territory than just one state or one MSA. So as you can see from the title, what I'll talk about here is where we were February 2020 and where we are today, and what I think it will happen in the next couple of months and potentially into 2021. What I think is interesting to note, let me go to the next slide real quick. So we do mostly retail. We'll do office, mixed use as well. This presentation will focus around retail. This slide right here is just overall commercial real estate volume in Oregon and Washington. Sales over 1 million is kind of what we focus on. I would have loved to talk about the power and grocery anchored center. This segment, it's just been completely non-existent. This is the first time that I can even go back and look at history to see that one grocery anchored center in Oregon and Washington has traded this year. And it was a little bit smaller one in a tertiary market in the Willamette Valley. Even back in 09, 10, in the depths of the recession, there were multiple sales in that category. We could see a few sell later this year. It's a little bit tougher space. When you're talking about a property with 20 or 30 tenants, the opportunity for COVID restrictions to play a role in that center is just far greater than a smaller property with 4 or 5 tenants where, those tenants could be open for business and doing just fine. So would love to talk about that, but there's just not much to talk about. In questions offline, I'm happy to kind of give you my take on valuations in that category. But again, it's tough when there's no comps to point to. So where we were, right? I mean, we were in a robust, stable market over the last 5 or 6 years, really. Obviously, your eyes go to 2019, and there's a reason for that. This is a call with a lot of folks up in the Seattle area. This had a lot to do with that excise tax increase that happened in 2020. The amount, just the sheer volume of Washington state sales last year was overly impressive. I've never seen anything like it. And there was no way we would have got to that volume in 2020, no matter, if COVID happened or not. It just wasn't going to happen. As you can see, it was, nearly double any other year going back to 15. So what we would have expected to see is a 2020 market in that 25 to 28 billion range. Interest rates were actually going down pretty significantly in January. I believe that's when the 10-year Treasury went below 1% for the first time. And so spread lenders were actually offering some interest rates we just hadn't seen. And I think without COVID, if that were to have taken place, we probably would have seen a pretty healthy year in terms of of retail, single tenant, multi-tenant sales, just given with interest rates around 3% for some property types, you know, that your cash on cash requirements can just be met with lower cap rates. And a lot of folks will look at cash on cash as their number one metric. Some don't, but a lot do. And that's obviously a huge factor. LTV is bigger, but interest rates obviously play a role. And this kind of highlights that. I don't, you know, the second half of the year, we saw a lot more in Washington State than the first half, but even pre-COVID, we weren't going to reach 2019 levels. It just wasn't going to happen. You might see a lot of people and articles published later this year that talk about year-over-year changes. Just take that with a huge grain of salt, because 2019 was an anomaly. What I like to look at is, you know, the 5-year average, and 2020 would have been right in line with the 5-year average. Cap rates. We're just talking about such a stable time period right here. I mean, you're talking about 5 or 6 years with fluctuations of, you know, 15 to 20 basis points, and that really could be due to a lot of different factors. You know, potentially one year having more investment grade sales than the year before. So I wouldn't look at the changes too much. I would just look at a trend line that is extremely stable. And what I think is interesting about this stretch of, you know, this robust market we've been in, this period of time is actually equal to pre-recession peak all the way up until when we surpassed the pre-recession peak in 2013, 2014. That was about 5 to 6 years. Now we've just been this stable, really strong market for the same period of time. Unprecedented. It's never happened. We've been talking about when will there be a correction for a lot of years. I don't think anyone would have guessed it would have been because of COVID, but this was just a really good run for our industry, and specifically in Oregon and Washington. So here we are, COVID era. This is Q2, Q3, all investment sales. I'll get into specifically retail soon. This is bad, right? This is what you expect to see. You're talking about sales volume that's been down, you know, somewhere between 60 and 70% across the board. We've always been in a supply constrained market. That's nothing new. We have urban growth boundaries. We have a much higher demand than we have sellers. Folks want to be here, and we all understand why. It's a great place to live and work, and that will never change, and it's been the case really since day one. So the supply side of things has been a constant. This, I want to talk about the demand. When you look at exchange buyers, they are by far the most impactful driver of demand for retail properties in that sort of $2 to $7 million range. They probably make up more like 80+% of the buyers when you talk about single tenant properties, specifically under 3 or 4 million. And obviously 1031 exchange buyers have one thing in common: they sold something. So to look at the future demand of exchange buyers, you really can just look at the last month or 2 or 3 of sales volume. And that's obviously concerning for us. There's been a lot of predictions made on this, and we'll get to that in just a second, but we are getting a little bit better. I can tell you, just even more recent, I made these slides just a couple of weeks ago. The last 2 weeks here internally, we've probably seen more demand and interest and activity than we've seen, you know, since February, which is a really good sign. I'm not exactly sure why that is. A lot of them are exchange buyers, but you know, it's interesting because there's a lot of money on the sidelines waiting for a deal too, which I think we all have heard that story, that the expectations between sellers and buyers right now that are not in a pinch in a 1031, there's a spread there. And that's common in any part of a cycle like this, where you have, you know, decreasing valuations, but sellers are still looking back 6, 7 months ago and saying, I want that number. So Q4, we actually expect Q4, what we're in right now, to be pretty decent compared to the last 5-year average. I think it will be lower, but looking back at Q2 and Q3 being down close to 70%, I don't see that happening. I see us being down more like 30 to 40%. Obviously, if you look at 2019, it's just, you can't compare it. I can tell you that Washington Q4 investment sales last year eclipsed 2018 and 17 Q4 combined. So again, is it all because of the excise tax rate increase? Probably not, but a lot of it had to do with that, especially when you get into the $5+ million range. That pricing difference to a seller is substantial. And in Washington, as we all know, excise taxes are a seller paid cost. In other areas of the country, it's actually split 50-50. And it's customary in Washington for the seller to eat that cost. So when you're talking about several $100,000 in additional selling cost, it becomes impactful for a lot of folks. Okay, so there was a lot of predictions made back in March and early April. And if you on LinkedIn and you follow a lot of these national groups, everybody was pretty much in agreement that cap rates would either increase slightly or increase moderately in the next 6 months. So this is that same graph I showed a few slides ago, but now we're including Q2 and Q3 of this year. You can see we've actually seen a pretty significant dip in cap rates. And while the predictions were incorrect, there's more to the story than that. And there's a good reason they were wrong. And we'll talk about that right now. So single tenant cap rates are now essentially the lowest on record. There was a period of time in 2017 where they were 6 basis points lower, but that's a pretty nominal amount. I would say that right now we are at record lows. And that is 100% due to this flight to quality. It's been overused before. I don't like to say that phrase all that much, but it's more real now than it ever has been. The amount of investment grade or strong private company retail sales are making up such a larger portion of the overall market that is making cap rates show you that they're going down. When in fact, in other asset classes, big box, lower credit rated companies, the opposite is happening. However, when you're only talking about 2 or 3 or 4 sales in 6 months, it doesn't skew the average that much. What we're seeing sell at near record or at record lows would be the 7-Elevens, the Starbucks, the Walgreens, O'Reilly's, Dutch Bros is a really good example of that. And lending rates still remain attractive here. That's another thing to consider. I mean, with the 10-year treasury rate as low as it is, a lot of lenders have instituted floors. LTVs are still a little questionable, but local credit unions and banks are still offering that 65 to 70% LTV, and rates are actually at or near record lows. So for folks that are in an exchange, it can actually make a lot of sense. Now we'll quickly talk about multi-tenant retail. That's a different story. So volume is just so low right now. And again, when you talk about having a retail, AKA strip center with 10 or 12 tenants, it makes sense. There's going to be some potential vacancies that weren't there before. Potentially capacity restrictions have, severely impacted their business, and they're still asking for rent relief. And if they're not getting it, I think there's a lot of fear from buyers that if this continues on through 2020 and into 2021, will they still be around? I mean, we've seen a lot of restaurants close, restaurants, bars, fitness. Those uses are being impacted greatly, especially in Portland and Seattle. It's interesting to know that that's not the case in the overall Northwest market. I flew back from Alaska last night. Anchorage is actually, they're open. There was a lot of traffic. The airport was busy. I didn't see a lot of closures. It was different to get up there. We were out in Boise a couple weeks ago. Same thing. The downtown is suffering because of the office. Workers aren't there. But outside of that, they are doing far better than we are. Now, obviously there's some risk that goes along with that with COVID. We won't get into that. But in terms of retail, they're actually performing quite a bit better than we are, which is unusual. Just over the last years, that's just not been the case. And so trying to do valuations on multi-tenant is tough. I put right on there, 6.5 cap is what the average multi-tenant retail center is sold at. That's a record low. And it's solely because there have been almost no higher risk, higher yield deals sell. There's been such a lack of inventory on Class A multi-tenant in metro areas like Seattle and Portland that when one gets on the market, it's actually selling at cap rates lower than pre-COVID because there's only one or two listed at a time, and there's still buyers that would rather have multi-tenant centers than single. There's a lot of buyers like that. They just don't like to put all their eggs in one basket. So because of that, you actually have enough demand and a lack of those higher yield sales where average cap rates, which you'll see in our newsletter at the end of this year, will likely be the lowest on record. But again, there's a reason for that. It's not indicative of the market in general. There's obviously have and have-nots here. And then, what's next? Obviously, it's an election year. We talk to hundreds and hundreds of folks a week. Everybody's interested in that. I think the biggest impact there is capital gains. If a new administration gets elected, the idea is to tax capital gains at ordinary income tax rates, which would be nearly double what they are today. Those don't go into effect retroactively, generally speaking. So 2021 could actually be a pretty big year for those folks trying to get ahead of that potential tax increase if they don't want to do a 1031 exchange. Obviously, 1031s are on the chopping block. That's nothing new. They've been on the chopping block before. I encourage everybody to reach out to their local representatives and tell them that should be completely off the table. The amount of working livable wage jobs that the 1031 market has maintained and created over the last 2 decades, I don't think they have any idea what that actually means. Obviously, getting a vaccine would help a lot versus having another wave. Lending environment, if we get some CMBS coming back online and we have LTVs that get up to a level we're used to seeing, that helps. 50, 55% doesn't work all the time. 65, 70 is what we need to see. Volatility in the stock market makes a pretty big impact on demand. Folks wanting investment grade, stable deals. And then does the buyer and seller expectations for non-exchange buyers start to align? At this point, it's not. A lot of folks in the sideline with cash are waiting for those deals. Will they get them? Only time will tell. Believe that's all I got. If anybody wants to reach out to me after this, I'm happy to discuss anything in greater detail. We have a lot of data. I try to make this as concise as possible. Email, phone call, LinkedIn, anything works. I appreciate the time.
Great. Thanks a lot, Lance. That was really good. Both good news and bad news, and exciting and not so exciting. So anyway, we're going to move into our last session. Thanks to Julian Rondello for helping to arrange to get Alex Muir with us. Alex has been with JLL and now is with Lee & Associates. And with JLL, he led an investment team. He's doing the same thing with Lee & Associates. But he's very interesting. The one thing I'll say is, he's won a lot of awards when he was at JLL around diversity, around ethics, and around, but quite frankly, it's just really clear that he's very involved with the community. The one thing I'll point out is the iTeen Urban, and that is something that he does outside of his job, where he brings in teens and young adults to help get them into our industry. A lot of great stuff. I don't want to take any more time because I don't want to cut into his space, but I would say very, very glad to have him with us. He does some really cool and great stuff. Somebody we want to stay connected with. So Alex, thank you for agreeing to be with us. Here you go.
Thanks a lot, Scott. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the office market, how it's evolved in the last 6 months, investment sales activity, and what we think of kind of the long-term prospects for the office market. Sorry, I'm trying to take control here, Scott. There we go. So despite being just the 15th largest MSA in the country, Seattle's pretty consistently punched above its weight class, and we've emerged as a tier 1 market internationally. 11 Fortune 500 companies are headquartered in the region. They come from a diverse set of industries, including obviously technology, life sciences, manufacturing, aerospace, and retail. These firms provide a really strong foundation for our office market, and they drive demand for space in Puget Sound. U.S. News and World Report ranked Washington, I should say, as the best state for economic growth and the third overall economy. I think coincidentally, our office market has experienced unprecedented growth in the last decade. I think some interesting images from Lori earlier probably speak to that better than anything, but according to the Ryder-Levitt Bucknell Crane Index, Seattle is currently leading the US in terms of number of active cranes. And this is an increase of about 7 from the first quarter this year, puts us back in the top spot where we had been for 3+ years in a row before being unseated for a short time to LA. Our peak actually was 65 cranes a couple years ago, so this is a decline, but there's still obviously a significant amount of construction activity happening. Most of that is residential, of course, but there is a lot of office construction as well. We have more than 5 million square feet currently being built. The primary driver for all the new supply that's coming is the rapidly growing tech tenants. Tech firms have pre-leased about 60% of all of the office construction that's set to deliver in the next 2 years. And demand is continuing to outpace supply. That's obviously changed a bit, which I'll touch on, but moving to the next slide. So as I mentioned, tech tenants have consistently accounted for more than half of our leasing activity over the last cycle. Last year, they absorbed more than 3.5 million square feet in the region. In addition to the locally growing companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Expedia, the Bay Area migration that started about 16 years ago with Google opening up an office in Kirkland has just continued to intensify. Bay Area firms have leased more than 6 million square feet locally in the last 5 years. Facebook, which is now one of the largest tenants in our region and a major employer, has a large presence on both sides of the lake in Seattle, as well as suburban Bellevue and Redmond. They recently bought REI's new 400,000 square foot headquarters at the Spring District. So again, that's one of the tenants that's still rapidly growing despite what's happened in the last 6 or 7 months. In addition to being a short flight away from California, Seattle's a top growth market for these Bay Area firms because primarily of our young, highly educated workforce. 65% of the adult population has a bachelor's degree at least, and we're really a hub for engineering talent, AR, VR talent, and cloud computing. It's a desirable city for tech employees as well because, as some of the previous speakers have mentioned, there's high quality of living, it's relatively affordable, strong job market. Again, you can see the average tech salary there, $119,000 is pretty comparable to San Francisco despite being a more inexpensive market to live in. To that point, even with significant rent growth that we've seen in residential real estate appreciation, Seattle remains a relative bargain. If you compare it side by side with San Francisco, you can see that commercial rent is about 40% cheaper. Median home sales price, again, $800,000 is significant growth from where we were 5 to 10 years ago. But again, it's half the price of a house in San Francisco. To rent is significantly cheaper. And what this works out to is, a much larger portion of salaries that employees actually get to take home. So again, cost of doing business is cheaper, and it's a cheaper place to live. And there aren't many major metro where you can be shopping downtown and then on the lake in 15 minutes or on a mountain in an hour. So again, we have a lot of things going for us. And because of these things, the office market has been steadily declining in terms of vacancy for the last decade. We've been one of the tightest major markets in the US, which is even more impressive, of course, because we've added nearly 30 million square feet of office in the cycle. Rents have consistently grown 4 to 7% annually. We're at about 5.5% for the last 5 years. There's been an average of more than 4 million square feet of space absorbed annually. 2020 got off to a great start. We had almost 2 million square feet absorbed in the first quarter, but obviously things came to a halt in March and April, and vacancy has been trending up since then. Rents have essentially flattened out. We're not seeing a substantial drop because most office buildings are stabilized, so landlords aren't necessarily having to stretch to get deals done. 10% vacancy is kind of considered a neutral office market, so we're still traditionally in what would be designated as slightly landlord favorable, but obviously in today's world, 100,000 or 100% leased building could be 10% occupied, so things have obviously evolved. And to that point, one of the things that we're tracking closely, and this says post-COVID, I do recognize we're in the middle of COVID, not post, but that's obviously after the onset, which we've kind of noted as March. is the availability of sublease space. And more than 1 million square feet of sublease space has come online in downtown Seattle alone. And the city currently accounts for about 63% of all available sublease space in the region. Not all this is directly attributable to COVID. The 3 largest actually chunks of space in Seattle that you can see on this page were available prior to COVID. Most of the new subleases that have come online are kind of 20,000 square feet and smaller with 2 to 3 years of term left. Most large tenant requirements remain on hold, and the leases that have been done in the last 6 months have primarily been short-term renewals and subleases. Typically, office tenants in our region will do 5 to 12-year leases, but there's obviously too much uncertainty in today's world for companies to feel comfortable signing a lease longer than 3 years, really, and spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars building out the space. So again, I mentioned Facebook previously. There are exceptions, and Amazon signed leases for more than 2 million square feet in Bellevue, but the companies that lack the resources are, for the most part, kicking the can and buying themselves some time to assess what a post-pandemic office will look like. Landlords, for the most part, are fine executing these short-term renewals because it keeps income coming and they don't have to shell out money for TIs. But of course, this has changed how we underwrite deals. So the obvious change here is market rent growth. And prior to COVID, for a typical office deal in Seattle or the East Side, the winning bidder was likely underwriting rent growth of at least 5% near term and 3% long term. For assets in prime submarkets like Seattle CBD, Bellevue CBD, or Lake Union, you could see rent growth in some cases as high as 6 to 8% for a couple of years and then kind of tapering down to 3%. Obviously, there are a lot of other subtle changes that differentiate value, and some buyers have cheaper capital or other competitive advantages. But in a lot of cases, it comes down to conviction in the market and how aggressive you're willing to get on that rent. What we're seeing most often now is minimal rent growth for 1 to 2 years, typically 0 to 3%. Then you'll get a little bit of a blip, 2 to 3 years out, you'll go maybe 5%, and again, taper kind of back down to 3% in perpetuity. I've heard of buyers getting creative and underwriting rent growth of 5 to 10%, or negative rent growth, I should say, of 5 to 10% for 1 to 2 years, and then try and swing it positive to get back to some level of normalcy. That's not really common, though. What's indicated here on the right is kind of more of what we're seeing now. Cap rates have shifted, but not dramatically. We're seeing kind of a 10 to 25 basis point move for most segments. But again, there are many other factors to weigh, and these include, and sorry, the slide got a little wonky here, but some other things to take into consideration are obviously debt. Interest rates are incredibly low, but for certain buildings, the LTV a buyer will be able to get is different than 6 months ago, and you may need more capital reserves. Buyers, in some cases, are having to underwrite more in CapEx to improve kind of safety and sanitation in buildings to make them more COVID resistant. Even if a building's fully leased, your parking income is obviously significantly different today than it was 6 months ago. And then a huge factor is obviously ground level retail, which has already been touched on. But in some cases, are the tenants still in business? Are they paying rent? If it's a restaurant or a bar that pays % rent, how much has that been affected? And how are buyers going to subsequently underwrite the future of that? So it's a little tough to answer the question of, is there a post-COVID discount, because it's so early and a lot of this is theoretical. But general underwriting has certainly shifted. And there are a couple interesting case studies to take a look at here briefly. The Harold Pohl building, it's a 60,000 square foot creative brick and beam building in the middle of downtown Seattle, just a block from the market. It was actually marketed in 2018, and there were 16 offers, 5 of which were in the $35 million range. Ultimately, the owner opted not to sell for personal reasons. At the time, we did an updated valuation this January, and we were in the $37 to $39 million range. The building ended up selling a week ago for $33.5 million, which is about a 5.25% going in yield. As you can see, that's about a 4% discount from 2018 and potentially double-digit drop from earlier this year. It's a great boutique office building. Again, there's good airflow, there's high ceilings, operable windows, there's things that are certainly favorable in a post-COVID world, but the decline in value came from, kind of a confluence of factors. The building has a weighted average lease term of less than 4 years. In-place rents are below market significantly, which again, these would have been appealing value add attributes 6 months ago, but again, they kind of scare some groups now. And then probably the biggest factor is the ground level retail. The restaurant that's on the corner there and has been there for 7 or 8 years has done incredible sales, but again, that's tough to project moving forward. Their percent rent is they've basically been paying 3 times what their base rent is. How do you look at that in the future if you're a buyer? And it's just a general thing that's obviously caused concern and likely affected pricing quite a bit. On the other hand, 200 Occidental, which is Weyerhaeuser's headquarters, is a core deal in Pioneer Square, new construction building, great quality tenant. Came to market in kind of February, March, just prior to COVID. We heard that guidance was about 170 million. And it reemerged a couple months ago, and it sounds like it's going to trade north of 160 million. So a slight drop in pricing, but less so than the more kind of value add core plus deal. You know, according to RCA's commercial property price index, pricing in Seattle is down about 2.7% year over year, which seems to be, you know, kind of the general consensus of what we're hearing is kind of 3 to 5%. Again, we only have about a dozen data points of sales, recent sales to kind of measure that too, but it feels about right. 2019 was obviously a record-breaking year for office sales. We had 10.9 billion in volume. As I think Lance mentioned, this was largely driven by the change in excise tax, change in real estate excise taxes. So we knew that 2020 wasn't going to match that, but obviously the precipitous decline is largely due to COVID. Again, last year there was 4.9 billion in just the fourth quarter alone. You know, we have 1.6 billion total year to date, and you know, we know of a few major attractions that are going to close, but we're going to get nowhere near to where the fourth quarter of last year was. You know, on the positive side, pricing has remained relatively flat. It's actually ticked up a bit. And cap rates, again, they're ticking down maybe 10 basis points, but have held pretty flat. There's a pretty clear difference in, I think, where the perceived discount is on buyer's side versus sellers. So it's interesting to kind of work with both. And I think, again, the discrepancy there is kind of accounting for why volume is down so much, besides just the obvious issue of not being able to tour for several months. This slide got a little wonky on us, but the point was that there's only been 3 $100 million sales that have closed year to date. There were 28 of those deals last year alone. Again, I won't go too much over my time to belabor the point, but the point is, you know, these were the transactions, these massive deals that drove us to nearly 11 billion in volume last year, and we just haven't seen them trade so far this year. There's a couple interesting cases, Tower 333 and REI headquarters, which kind of speak to the strength of the East Side market. Tower 333 traded at well north of 900 a foot, and the same as the REI headquarters, which Facebook bought. Again, East Side has been growing and gaining strength for years, and that's only intensified with Facebook, Google, Oculus, Amazon growing there rapidly. So looking forward to when things are going to kind of rebound to typical investment activity that we would expect in Seattle. You know, our markets historically rebounded relatively quickly. We have a very strong economy, strong and diverse economy. And based on kind of general conversations we've had with investors, it sounds like investment activity will return to normal in 12 to 18 months. At least that's the hope. Again, obviously, this is all dependent on a vaccine to the virus, I should say. Interest rates remaining where they are, but there's certainly not a lack of capital. You know, private equity firms have 147 billion that's waiting to be deployed in the US, and Seattle has kind of cemented itself as a top 5 market nationally for office investment. So assuming we get a vaccine in the next year, interest rates remain favorable, tech companies continue growing locally, we believe that investors looking for yield are going to aggressively pursue deals in Seattle. And just to kind of look at the quick crystal ball moving forward, which again, I won't belabor because it's been touched on a few times, but some of the trends that we're seeing we think are here to stay in some form or another, and some we think are kind of blips. You know, work from home, having a flexible work environment is clearly here to stay. You know, to what extent it's still TBD on that. You know, companies flocking to the suburbs we think is a bit overblown. Again, on kind of a micro level, companies moving from Seattle to the suburban East Side markets makes sense in what's happening prior to COVID, right? There's transit there now. There are great schools. There are a number of reasons to move to Bellevue. There's available space, right? Seattle's constrained by water. There there are a lot of good things going for Bellevue prior to COVID. But, you know, COVID pushing some groups out of more urban, dense environments, and what's happening with the Seattle City Council is certainly going to, could certainly kind of quicken the shift to the east side. Payroll tax, you know, on the Seattle City Council note is one that we're still waiting to see how much of an impact it has. But again, it's something that groups are already considering. Bellevue, Kirkland, Redmond are likely to consider them even more strongly now. Kind of distressed assets, you know, we haven't seen much of that yet. Again, most of our office product is stabilized with institutional ownership groups, but you would assume that, you know, that's going to come due, and there are going to be some opportunities that come in the next 12 to 18 months. And then on the election, I don't have much to add to what Lance mentioned. It's, you know, 1031 exchanges. It's a big question mark. Besides that, it'll just be nice in a few months, hopefully, to have some more certainty on what the world's going to look like. But yeah, as a whole, you know, we're very optimistic about Seattle long term. Again, we think, you know, we're going to bounce back quick. Things will be good and moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. That was really good insight. And yeah, a lot for us Seattleites to be proud of for working here. And obviously there's quite a change from 2019 to 2020. But reasons like the excise tax and city council mandates, it all makes sense to us, not just simply COVID. So thank you for the insight. This is really informative. So now we'll move forward to the Q&A session. Thank you for those who submitted questions. You know, we still have about 22 minutes to go, so we understand if you have to leave, we get it, but we encourage people to stick around for the questions now. So at this point, I will kick it over to Deanne. She's compiled all the questions, and we'll get rolling. So Deanne, go ahead and take over.
Thanks, Mitch. And again, as a reminder, if you have questions now, I'll keep watching the chat box, so you can go ahead and type those in. So the first few questions are for Lori. And the first one is, who pays to maintain the swales?
So the swale operations, the maintenance is part of our property management. But then when the swales need to be completely, you know, when the plants need to be replaced, which needs to happen periodically, then that would be the responsibility of Seattle Public Utilities.
Next question, also for Lori. Can you speak to how long it takes the developer to recoup the cost of the gray water or the chiller system?
That is that's a great question, and we actually have our consultant Ecotrope tracking information at the Sitka Apartments. They've only been operational for about a year, so we're just starting to get some of that data in, and I don't have the answer to that, but we definitely see it as you know, making sense financially for us to do. But I would be, whoever asked that question, when we have more, if you want to send me an email directly, when we have more information, I'd be happy to share that.
Great. And Lori, the next two questions I'm going to ask together because they seem to be related. Do you have an estimate of the percentage increase in cost to be salmon safe? And how many contractors are there in the Seattle area that are salmon safe certified?
So the first question having to do with the cost, it has to do with the cost of salmon safe to do a project that's certified. So the project certification costs, so to be salmon safe credit, our developer cost is a $15,000 commitment over, I think, every 3 years or 5 years it gets renewed. In fact, it's 3 years because we're just doing that again now. The project, those are, you know, in the thousands of dollars. It's not, I mean, it's not a huge cost. In terms of the number of contractors, I mean, all of the major contractors at this point, because we use them all, you know, GLY, Turner, I think Selin is probably at this point. A lot of the majors are, and I know that we're actually, our next set of development projects, we're using a number of new contractors, and they will all be required if they want to work with us to become salmon safe certified, accredited. So I don't know the number right off the top of my head, but it's you know, the big ones, all the big ones really, most of the big ones are.
Thank you. So the next questions are for Matt. Regarding the hotel sector, do we know the status of the Seattle Center convention expansion? Do we still have Matt with us?
You know, he's on the screen. I'll send him a quick text to make sure. He might have just stepped away for a second.
Okay. Let's see, I'm looking, all of our questions are for Matt. Oh, here's one for Alex. Alex, do you see urban office being as popular as it was in 2018 to 2019?
Generally, yes. I think it'll bounce back. I think that's kind of a twofold question. Urban office in Bellevue, I feel great about. You know, if I was a developer and we work on quite a few land transactions, and the preference certainly has shifted for especially high-rise sites to downtown Bellevue as opposed to Seattle. So if I was building a new project today, I would probably feel better about that side of the lake. But in general, I think cities will bounce back. Again, I think the mass exodus is a bit overblown, and historically cities have bounced back quickly. So in general, I would feel good about it. Again, there's going to be cost measures of getting some of these buildings up to date and having tenants feel good about going back to them. I would probably feel slightly better if I owned high rise in Bellevue than I do in Seattle, but yes, I guess is the short answer.
Right. And Alex, another couple questions for you. Do you see any concerns about urban office after the pandemic?
Again, assuming the money's put into making these buildings, again, good in terms of health and from a health and wellness perspective, yes, I think some companies are certainly going to want to have more employees work from home, or at least for 1 to 2 days a week. That could shift things. I think some tenants are going to want to get less dense. Again, some tenants will want to get back space. Some tenants will get less dense. How do those things net out? I think is a little too soon to tell. And there's kind of cost measures that go into making buildings, appealing to tenants. So again, there's certainly more interest now in suburban product, and in some cases low to mid-rise product in like a Fremont, which is just on the outskirts of downtown. But I think in some cases those buildings are starting to thrive pre-pandemic because of transit. So it's tough to say what's kind of accounting for what. But again, long term, I feel good about downtown core product.
Great. Another question for you, Alex. Do you think Amazon will shrink its footprint in the city of Seattle?
That's probably a better question for Lori. I think they're going to grow much quicker on the east side. I guess the one announcement they've made so far is that they will be vacating 2201 Westlake at the end of that lease. So I guess if I want to go just strictly off news headlines, I guess in the near term, yes. They're still obviously developing office towers in kind of the Belltown, Denny Regrade area. I'm undecided on that one. I go back and forth on that kind of day to day. I want Lori's answer.
Actually, since I don't have any, any special insight other than my own opinion, but I think that we might see Amazon staying in buildings where they're the only tenant, and maybe giving up space where they're not the only tenant. And that kind of is consistent with what you just mentioned at 2201, where they shared the space with Path. But on the flip side, the 1918 building, which is currently being marketed for sale, they are renewing there. So it's interesting. So.
And Lori, we got another question for you. How do chemicals, drugs, etc., get filtered out of the gray water? And if they do?
That is an excellent question, and I am not a scientist, and I cannot possibly answer that to any degree of veracity. I know that we would not have a system in place that wasn't safe, but that's a really good question, and it's something that I think that is worth getting an answer to. So let me ask my folks, and again, if you want to get in touch with me directly, I'd be happy to see if I can find an answer to that. I know that's a big issue with, you know, with water that's going out into our watershed.
Thank you, Lori. Just had another question come in for Alex. Are there must-have and nice-to-have healthy building features, e.g. 100% outside area, touchless fixtures, touchless doors, etc.?
I think you just mentioned 3 or 4 of the top ones. Yeah, I would say touchless features is probably going to be a must-have. I think air filtration, again, Lori, from the landlord's perspective side of what some of these measures actually cost, I think would be valuable, but that's going to be something that at least is desirable to have operable windows, to have better air filtration. I would say is probably a must-have. What's the cost to implement these things? I'm not sure. Touchless features for sure, obviously. Signage and some of the basic things about who can be in elevators and where they can stand are must-haves. Literally in some of the office buildings, you have kind of the partitions of ways that you can walk through lobbies. I think some of these things are probably must-haves moving forward. But I think the 3 that you initially mentioned there are at worst nice-to-haves, probably must-haves.
Thank you.
Hey, Deanne, I just did get a message from Matt. Actually, he had to, he's got a client waiting for him and they've got to run and go do a quick tour of the property. And so he said he'd be happy to answer any questions by email. So if we want to kind of forward that to him, we can put this back out to the group. And I'm kind of laughing. I did send a quick message to John Gordon, who's all knows, you know, he does a lot of hotel work, and he and I actually shared an office several years ago as we kind of grew up in the hotel valuation space. But you know, he doesn't have a microphone right now, and he's also a good resource. He puts out a great publication on that. But the one thing I will say, and I can't remember who asked the question about the lenders, because I have done a lot of reading around that, and you know, I mean, in terms of CMBS properties that are moving from master servicing into special servicing being those problems that, or those properties that have difficulties paying their mortgages. And so, you know, they go to a special servicing group, and then they kind of get worked out from there. Either they come back out, or ultimately the property gets taken away. Hotels are way up, and there has been forbearance. There's been quite a bit of forbearance up until now, you know, and there have been a few things that have propped up the ability for hotel owners to hang on to their properties. But now there are a lot of properties now that are moving back into special servicing. And there's actually been a recent announcement of a transfer of ownership of a number of Marriott properties, you know, and that was through more of a management contract agreement, you know, but I think we're going to see a lot of hotel properties. They're going to change hands, and either change hands, you know, by their choice, and maybe even take the losses, or even not by their choice. So, you know, I think hotels, probably like retail, you know, there's going to be a lot of pain ahead of us on that one. So, but Matt can also answer that. John Gordon's a great resource. We've got a lot of folks in our chapter that are really good at hotels. So anyway, I did kind of want to answer that a little bit, just because that's kind of a space I do a lot of work in, but at the same time, you know, there's a lot of folks that can answer that too. So Matt, I'll be happy to get some of those answers back out to us. And he apologized. He actually called me and said, "Look, Scott, I'm really sorry. I had to run out. I got a property tour, and I got to meet my clients in the lobby." So, you know, but he did appreciate being with us.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions coming through on chat.
Good. Well, I think this rounds up our morning session. So thank you to all of our speakers, Alex and Lance and Lori and Matt. We really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you to the sponsors again, all the friends of the conference. Thank you to Deanne and Hartman Group for assisting with the support system. Deanne, again, she was new as of, I believe, July. So it's kind of a quick learning curve, but she's been fantastic to work with. So thank you very much. Just a quick note too, you know, we do have the residential section that is starting at 2 o'clock today, but just put in your mind right now that we have a third component to this that's in January, January 22nd. We have a kind of a full economic kind of rundown with Matthew Gardner. So just remember that January 22nd, you will see some invites going out over the next couple weeks and a couple months. So put that in your mind. But overall, thank you, everybody. This concludes the morning session, and we hope to see you guys all at 2 o'clock today for the residential component. So thank you all.